"You're not just a burden, Margaret, you're the reason we can't move forward," my daughter-in-law said, her voice calm, almost polite, as if she were discussing the weather instead of dismantling my place in this family, and my son, my own son, didn't correct her, didn't even look at me, just stared down at his plate like the answer might be hiding between the lines of the wood grain, and in that moment, something inside me didn't break the way I thought it would, it didn't shatter or collapse. It simply went quiet, like a door closing softly in a house that used to be full of noise. I folded my napkin carefully and placed it beside my untouched dinner, the pot roast I had cooked for 4 hours, the same recipe my late husband used to praise every Sunday, and I nodded once, not to them, but to myself, because clarity has a way of arriving without warning, and when it does, it leaves no room for doubt. I had spent the last 3 years telling myself that things were just different. That grief changes people, that Daniel was overwhelmed, that Ashley didn't really mean the things she said when she thought I couldn't hear. I told myself I was imagining the coldness, the way conversations stopped when I entered a room, the way decisions were made without me in a house I had lived in for over 30 years, but sitting there at that table, under the soft yellow light of a dining room I once filled with laughter, I realized something far more unsettling than their words. I realized they believed it, not just Ashley, but Daniel too. They believed I was in the way, an inconvenience, a leftover piece of a life that no longer fit into theirs, and the strange thing was, I didn't feel anger, not yet. What I felt was something colder, something sharper, like stepping outside on a winter morning and realizing the air is thinner than you remembered. I stood up slowly, my knees reminding me of my 72 years, but my hands steady, my voice even when I finally spoke. "I understand," I said, and for the first time that evening, Daniel looked up, just for a second, as if he wasn't expecting that, as if he had prepared himself for tears or resistance or pleading, but I offered. "None of it." I walked upstairs to my bedroom, the one at the end of the hall with the window that faced the oak tree my husband planted the year we moved in, and I closed the door behind me, not with force, just enough to separate their world from mine. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around at the life I had built piece by piece, the photographs, the quilts, the quiet evidence of decades spent giving everything I had to people I believed would always see me as more than what I could provide, and that was when the thought came to me, not as a question, but as a decision, simple, clear, and irreversible. If they had already decided what I was worth, then it was time I decided what they deserved, and by the time I lay down that night, staring at the ceiling I had stared at beside my husband for over 30 years, I knew exactly what I was going to do, and more importantly, I knew I wouldn't say a word about it, not yet. I woke up before sunrise the next morning, not because I had somewhere to be, but because the house had already started to feel unfamiliar, as if it no longer recognized me as someone who belonged within its walls. The silence was different now, heavier, like it was waiting for something to happen. I lay there for a moment staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the distant sound of a car passing by, and I realized that for the first time in years, I was not thinking about what I needed to do for someone else. There was no list forming in my head, no reminders about groceries or laundry or whether Daniel liked his coffee a certain way. There was only a single, steady thought, clear and unmoving. I had already made my decision. I got out of bed slowly, my joints stiff but cooperative, and walked over to the window. The oak tree outside stood exactly as it always had, strong, rooted, unchanged by the quiet shift happening inside this house. I rested my hand against the glass for a second longer than usual before turning away. There was no reason to linger. I dressed in simple clothes, the kind I used to wear when I needed to get things done, not to impress anyone, but because they were practical, dependable. I tied my hair back neatly and glanced at myself in the mirror, not searching for reassurance, just confirming what I already knew. I looked exactly like a woman who had been underestimated for far too long. Downstairs, the kitchen was empty. Ashley's coffee machine was already blinking, set to brew at 7 sharp. Everything in this house ran on schedules now, precise, efficient, controlled. I moved quietly, not because I was afraid of waking them, but because I did not feel the need to announce myself anymore. I poured myself a glass of water instead of coffee, letting the coolness settle my thoughts. The dining table still held the faint outline of last night's dinner, a small stain near my place setting where the gravy had spilled slightly. No one had bothered to clean it. I reached for a cloth and wiped it away in one smooth motion. Not out of habit, but out of closure, I walked toward the front door and paused only briefly as I picked up my purse. Inside it, tucked carefully in the inner pocket, were the documents I had not looked at in years, papers my husband had insisted I keep safe, even when I told him there was no need, that everything we had was already shared. He had only smiled and said, just in case. At the time, I thought he was being overly cautious. Now, I understood that he had seen something I had chosen to ignore. I stepped outside into the crisp morning air, the kind that carries just enough chill to make you feel awake. The driveway was empty, Daniel's car already gone, Ashley's SUV still parked, pristine as always. I closed the door behind me without making a sound, not as an act of secrecy, but as a quiet acknowledgement that I was stepping into a different version of my life, one where I would no longer wait to be invited to my own table. The sidewalk stretched ahead, familiar yet strangely distant, and as I began to walk, each step steady and deliberate, I felt something shift inside me, not anger, not sadness, but a calm certainty that whatever came next would not be decided by them, not anymore. I did not go far, not at first, just a few blocks down the street to the small branch bank on the corner where the same American flag had been hanging slightly crooked for as long as I could remember, the kind of place people overlook because it looks ordinary, predictable, but I had learned that the most important things in life are often kept in places like that, quiet, unremarkable, secure. The glass doors slid open with a soft hiss as I stepped inside, and for a moment I simply stood there, letting my eyes adjust to the bright interior, the polished floors, the faint scent of paper and ink. It had been years since I had come here in person. Most things were done online now, automated, distant, but some decisions require a physical presence, a signature, a moment where you look someone in the eye and make it clear that you know exactly what you are doing. The young teller at the counter greeted me with a polite smile, the kind that is trained, efficient, but not unkind, and I returned it with a nod, not lingering, not explaining, just stating quietly that I needed to speak with someone about a personal account. She hesitated for a second before directing me to a small office in the back, where a man in his late 40s sat behind a desk cluttered with folders. His nameplate read Thomas Green, and when he looked up at me, there was something different in his expression, not recognition, but attentiveness. As if he understood that I was not there for something routine. I sat down across from him and placed my purse on my lap, my hands resting lightly on top of it, steady, composed. He asked how he could help me, and for a brief second, I considered how to answer that question, not because I did not know, but because the words carried weight. They marked the line between the life I had been living and the one I was about to step into. I reached into my purse and carefully pulled out the documents my husband had given me years ago. The edges slightly worn but still crisp, still valid. I slid them across the desk without a word, and Thomas adjusted his glasses, leaning forward as he began to read. I watched his face, not impatiently, but with quiet focus, the way you watch the sky when you are waiting for a storm to break. His expression shifted slowly, from neutral to curious, then to something more serious, something that told me he understood exactly what he was looking at. He glanced up at me once, as if to confirm, and I met his gaze without hesitation. No explanation, no apology, just certainty. You would like to proceed with this? He asked carefully, and I nodded once. Yes, I said, my voice calm, measured, as if I had been saying it all my life, because in a way, I had been preparing for this moment without realizing it. He sat back slightly, processing, then nodded in return, reaching for a form, a pen, the mechanics of change beginning to take shape in small, precise movements. As he explained the steps, the adjustments, the legal confirmations that would follow, I listened without interrupting, absorbing each word, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to understand every detail, every consequence, not for them, but for myself. When he finally placed the paper in front of me, pointing to the line where I needed to sign, I picked up the pen and held it for a second longer than necessary, not out of doubt, but out of recognition. This was not just ink on paper, it was a boundary being drawn, a shift in control, a quiet refusal to remain where I was no longer respected. I signed my name slowly, deliberately, each letter clear, steady, final. And as I set the pen down, I felt it again, that same calm certainty that had followed me since the night before, only stronger now, more defined, as if something that had been dormant for years had finally woken up, and this time, it was not going back to sleep. When I stepped out of the bank, The sunlight felt different, not warmer, not brighter, just clearer, as if the world had quietly adjusted itself to match the decision I had just made. I paused on the sidewalk for a moment, letting the door close behind me with a soft click, and I realized that for the first time in years, I was not thinking about how my actions would affect anyone else. There was no second guessing, no silent calculation of whether I was being too much or asking for too little. There was only the steady awareness that something had shifted, and it was not going to shift back. I began walking again, not in a hurry, but with purpose, each step measured, each breath even. The small coffee shop across the street had just opened, the same place my husband and I used to visit on Saturday mornings, back when time felt slower and conversations lasted longer than the coffee in our cups. I hesitated for half a second before pushing the door open, the bell above it chiming softly. Inside, the air was warm and smelled faintly of fresh pastries and ground beans. A young woman behind the counter greeted me with an easy smile, and I ordered a simple black coffee, nothing added, nothing hidden. I carried the cup to a table by the window and sat down, wrapping my hands around it, feeling the heat seep into my fingers, grounding me in the present. Outside, people moved along the street in quiet routines, unaware of the small, invisible turning point that had just taken place in my life. I took a slow sip and let my thoughts settle, not drifting, not wandering, but aligning. For years, I had convinced myself that patience was strength, that silence was dignity, that if I just endured long enough, things would find their way back to something resembling respect. But sitting there, watching the reflection of my own face in the glass, I understood something I had not allowed myself to see before. Endurance without boundaries is not strength, it is permission, and I had given that permission far too easily. I set the cup down and reached into my purse, pulling out my phone. The screen lit up with a handful of missed notifications, none of them important, none of them from Daniel, which did not surprise me. I scrolled for a moment before stopping on his name, my thumb hovering just above it, not hesitating, just acknowledging the choice. I did not call, I did not send a message. I simply locked the screen and placed the phone back into my purse. There would be time for conversations later, but not before I finished what I had started. I finished my coffee slowly, deliberately, as if marking the end of something I had carried for far too long, and when I finally stood up, adjusting my coat and stepping back out onto the street, I no longer felt like someone who had been pushed out of her own life. I felt like someone who had stepped out of it by choice, and that difference, quiet as it was, changed everything about the way the world looked to me, because now, for the first time in a very long time, I was not waiting for a place to belong, I was deciding where I would stand. By the time I returned home, the house was no longer quiet in the same way it had been that morning. There was a subtle shift in the air, the kind you only notice when you have spent years paying attention to what is not being said. Ashley's car was gone now, which meant she had likely gone out for errands or lunch with friends, the routine she maintained with careful precision. Daniel's car was still missing, as expected, his workdays stretching longer and longer over the years, leaving less and less space for anything that did not fit neatly into his schedule. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, not pausing this time, not lingering in the entryway as I once did, listening for voices or movement. I walked straight through the living room, past the furniture I had chosen decades ago, pieces that had once felt like part of me, now arranged in a way that felt curated rather than lived in. I moved toward the hallway closet and opened it, reaching for the small lockbox on the top shelf, the one Daniel had never asked about, the one Ashley had never noticed. Inside were a few remaining documents, copies of older records, things I had kept not because I needed them, but because I had never quite been ready to let them go. I carried the box to the dining table and sat down, opening it slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for what it represented. Years of decisions made quietly, responsibilities carried without acknowledgement. I sorted through the papers one by one, my movement steady, my thoughts focused. There was no rush, no urgency, only the calm understanding that each piece still had a role to play. As I reviewed them, small details began to align in a way they never had before, names, dates, signatures, connections that had once seemed routine now revealed a structure, a foundation that had never truly shifted ownership in the way Daniel and Ashley believed. I placed a few documents aside, setting them in a neat stack, the ones that mattered most, the ones that would ensure clarity when the time came. I closed the box and returned it to its place, not hiding it, just returning it to where it belonged. As I stood there, I heard the faint sound of a car pulling into the driveway, followed by the click of a door and the familiar rhythm of footsteps approaching. Ashley's voice carried through the front hallway a moment later, light, casual, as if nothing had changed. "Margaret, are you home?" she called out, and I stepped out from the hallway just as she entered the living room, her expression neutral at first, then shifting slightly when she saw me standing there, composed, present, unchanged. "You are back early," she said, a small note of surprise in her tone. I met her gaze without tension, without challenge, simply acknowledging her presence. "I had a few things to take care of," I replied, my voice even, offering nothing more. She studied me for a second longer than usual, as if trying to read something beneath the surface, but finding nothing she could name. "Well," she said, adjusting her bag on her shoulder, "Daniel and I were actually talking about last night," she continued, her tone softening slightly, carefully measured. "We think it might be best if we start looking at some options for you. Somewhere more suitable, less demanding." The word lingered in the air, chosen with intention. I listened without interrupting, without reacting, letting her finish, and when she did, I simply nodded once. "That sounds like something you should think through carefully," I said, not agreeing, not refusing, just placing the weight of the decision back where it belonged. She blinked, just for a moment, as if the response was not what she expected, as if she had prepared for resistance and found only stillness instead. "We just want what is best for everyone," she added quickly, filling the silence, and I gave a small, polite smile, the kind that reveals nothing. "Of course you do," I said, and in that moment, I realized something else with quiet certainty. They still believed they were in control, and for now, I was content to let them keep believing that. That evening, the house settled into its usual rhythm, the quiet hum of appliances, the soft echo of footsteps overhead, the distant sound of a television playing something neither of them were truly watching. I remained in the living room, seated in the same armchair I had used for years, a book resting open in my hands though I had not turned a page in quite some time. I listened instead, not to their words, but to the spaces between them, the subtle shifts in tone, the way Ashley's voice carried just a little more confidence than it had the day before, the way Daniel responded with short, agreeable phrases, as if the decision had already been made and all that remained was the formality of informing me. I did not need to hear every word to understand the direction of their thoughts. I had lived long enough to recognize when people believed they were approaching the end of a process, when in reality, they had only just begun something they did not fully understand. Later, when the house grew quieter and their voices faded into the background, I closed my book and set it aside, standing slowly and making my way toward the study at the end of the hallway. The room had changed over the years, once filled with my husband's papers, his notes, the quiet evidence of a man who believed in structure and preparation. Now it was mostly used for storage, a place where things were kept but rarely examined. I stepped inside and turned on the small desk lamp, the soft light illuminating the surface just enough to see clearly without drawing attention. I opened the bottom drawer and reached toward the back, my fingers brushing against the familiar edge of a folder I had not touched in years. I pulled it out carefully and placed it on the desk, opening it with the same deliberate calm that had guided me through the rest of the day. Inside were copies of correspondence, letters from my husband, notes written in his precise handwriting, reminders of conversations we had once had about responsibility, about foresight, about making sure that what we built would not be easily undone by assumption or convenience. I read through them slowly, not because I needed to relearn what they said, but because I wanted to remember the intent behind them, the quiet insistence he had always carried, the way he had prepared not just for himself, but for me, even when I had not fully understood why. As I turned the final page, one detail stood out with a clarity that felt almost intentional, a clause, a condition, something small enough to be overlooked by anyone who was not paying close attention, but significant enough to shift the entire balance of control. I rested my hand lightly on the paper, letting the realization settle, not as a shock, but as confirmation. They had built their plans on the assumption that everything had already been transferred, that ownership had changed in ways that suited their narrative, but the truth was quieter, more precise, and far less convenient for them. I closed the folder and returned it to its place, not hiding it, just placing it back where it belonged, and as I turned off the lamp and stepped out of the study, I felt that same steady certainty rise again, not rushed, not dramatic, just present, because now I knew something they did not, and that difference, small as it seemed, was enough to change everything that would come next. The next morning arrived without announcement, the kind of quiet continuation that follows a decision already set in motion. I moved through the house as I always had, preparing breakfast, wiping down the counter, placing a cup of coffee near Daniel's usual seat even though I knew he would barely touch it, not because I needed to, but because routines have a way of disguising intention, and for now, I preferred it that way. Ashley came down first, her steps measured, her expression composed. She greeted me with a polite smile that did not reach her eyes, the kind of smile that signals agreement has already been reached somewhere else. We have been thinking more about what we discussed, she said, reaching for a glass and filling it with water. There is a place about 15 miles from here, very nice, very comfortable, I think. You would like it, I nodded as I placed a plate on the table, not reacting, not questioning, just listening. That sounds like something worth looking into, I replied evenly, and she seemed almost relieved, as if my lack of resistance confirmed something she had hoped was already true. Daniel joined us a moment later, his tie slightly crooked, his attention already divided between the conversation and whatever awaited him outside this house. He avoided my eyes at first, then glanced at me. Briefly, searching for something, perhaps conflict, perhaps hesitation, but finding neither. We can schedule a visit this weekend, he said, his tone careful, measured, just to see what it is like. I met his gaze calmly, offering a small nod. Of course, I said, and that was enough. No argument, no tension, just acceptance, or at least the appearance of it. Breakfast passed quietly after that, the kind of silence that feels organized rather than accidental, as if every word had already been decided in advance. When Daniel left for work, he paused at the door for a fraction of a second longer than usual, turning slightly as if he might say something, but then choosing not to. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and the house returned to stillness. Ashley gathered her things shortly after, moving with a sense of efficiency that suggested she believed progress was being made. We will talk more tonight, she said as she headed out, and I offered the same polite smile, the same calm acknowledgement. I will be here, I replied, and when the door finally closed again, I stood alone in the quiet that followed, not empty, not uncertain, but steady. I walked back to the dining table and sat down, placing my hands flat against the surface, feeling the smooth wood beneath my palms, grounding myself in the present moment. Everything they were planning depended on one assumption: that I would follow the path they had outlined, that I would agree, comply, transition quietly into the role they had assigned to me. But plans built on assumptions have a way of unraveling when the foundation shifts, and I had already begun to move that foundation, not visibly, not loudly, but precisely, each step calculated, each action aligned with something they had not yet considered. I reached for my phone and dialed a number I had not used in years, waiting as it rang once, then twice, before a familiar voice answered on the other end, steady, professional, unchanged by time. This is Margaret Whitmore, I said calmly, my voice clear, certain. I would like to schedule a meeting to finalize the next steps. There was a brief pause, then a simple response: of course, Mrs. Whitmore, we have been expecting your call. And as I ended the call, placing the phone gently back on the table, I allowed myself a moment of stillness, not to reflect, not to question, but to recognize that everything was now in motion, and this time, I was the one deciding where it would lead. The meeting was set for the following afternoon, a time chosen not for convenience, but for precision. I arrived 10 minutes early, not out of habit, but because I wanted to sit in the quiet before anything was said. The office was exactly as I remembered it: understated, orderly, the kind of place where decisions are made without emotion but with lasting consequence. Thomas Green greeted me with the same measured professionalism, though this time there was something more behind it, an awareness that what we were about to finalize was not a routine adjustment. I took my seat and placed my purse beside me, my hands resting calmly in my lap. There was no need to rush, no need to explain. He began by reviewing the documents, each page turned with care, each detail confirmed with quiet clarity, as he spoke, outlining the structure, the protections, the conditions that had been written long ago and were now being activated. I listened closely, not because I was uncertain, but because I wanted to hear it spoken aloud, to understand not just what had been prepared, but how it would unfold from this point forward. The language was precise, deliberate, leaving no room for interpretation. The house, the accounts, the investments, none of it had ever fully transferred in the way Daniel and Ashley assumed. The authority remained where it had always been, protected by clauses they had never thought to question. Once this is filed, Thomas said, pausing briefly as he looked at me, any changes made without your direct authorization will be considered invalid. I nodded once, absorbing the weight of that sentence, not as a victory, but as a correction, something being restored to its original balance. He slid the final set of papers across the desk, indicating where I needed to review, where I needed to confirm, and finally, where I needed to sign. I read through each line carefully, not skimming, not assuming. Each word mattered, each condition carried intention. When I reached the final page, I picked up the pen again, the same deliberate motion as before, steady, controlled, and I signed my name, not with hesitation, but with clarity. When I placed the pen down, Thomas gathered the documents and nodded. Everything will be processed by the end of the day, he said, and I offered a small, composed smile. Thank you, I replied, standing slowly, not because I was tired, but because the moment itself required a certain stillness. As I stepped out of the office, the air outside felt unchanged, the same steady rhythm of people moving through their day, unaware that something fundamental had just shifted. I walked back toward the street, my pace unhurried, my posture unchanged. There was no outward sign of what had been set in motion, no announcement, no declaration. And that was exactly how it needed to be, because the most effective changes are the ones that do not draw attention until they are already complete. When I returned home later that afternoon, the house looked exactly as it had that morning, everything in place, everything appearing stable. Ashley was in the kitchen, her movements efficient, controlled. She glanced at me briefly, her expression neutral. We made an appointment for Saturday, she said, as if continuing a conversation that had already been decided. The facility has an opening, and we think it would be a good fit. I set my purse down gently and met her gaze with the same calm presence. That sounds very organized, I replied, and she nodded, satisfied, unaware that the structure she believed she was building no longer rested on solid ground. And as I moved past her, toward the hallway, I felt that same quiet certainty settle in once more, not sharp, not urgent, just steady, because now everything was in place, and all that remained was time. Saturday arrived with a kind of quiet certainty that did not need to announce itself. The morning unfolded exactly as they had planned. Ashley moved through the house with a sense of purpose, checking details, confirming times, adjusting small things that made her feel in control. Daniel followed her rhythm, not leading, not questioning, simply aligning himself with the direction she had already set. I prepared myself without urgency, choosing a simple coat, smoothing my hair, moving through each step with the same calm precision that had guided me all week. When we finally sat down in the car, the air between us was composed, polite, almost rehearsed. Ashley spoke lightly about the place we were going to visit, describing the amenities, the comfort, the community, each word carefully chosen to sound like opportunity rather than displacement. Daniel added small comments, supportive but distant, as if repeating something he had already agreed to. I listened without interruption, my gaze steady on the road ahead, not absorbing their words, but observing the confidence behind them, the belief that everything was proceeding exactly as they intended. The drive took just under 20 minutes, the facility appearing at the end of a long, neatly maintained driveway. The building was clean, orderly, designed to feel welcoming, but I recognized it for what it was, a place chosen not because it suited me, but because it suited their plans. We stepped inside and were greeted by a receptionist whose smile was practiced but kind. She guided us through the halls, pointing out common areas, dining spaces, small details meant to reassure. Ashley nodded along, engaged, invested. Daniel remained quiet, his attention shifting between the environment and me, as if searching for a reaction that never came. I walked beside them, observing everything, not resisting, not agreeing, simply present. When the tour concluded, we were led into a small office to discuss the next steps. Paperwork was placed on the desk, brochures arranged neatly, options presented as choices. Ashley leaned forward slightly, her posture signaling readiness. This seems like a very good fit, she said, her voice confident, final. Daniel glanced at me, waiting. The room settled into a brief silence, the kind that usually invites agreement. I placed my hands gently on the edge of the desk and looked at them both. Not with defiance, not with emotion, just with clarity. It is very well organized, I said calmly, and Ashley smiled, as if that was enough, as if the decision had already been confirmed, but before she could speak again, the door behind us opened softly, and Thomas Green stepped into the room, his presence unexpected to them, but entirely anticipated by me. He greeted us politely, his tone professional, measured. "Mrs. Whitmore asked me to join you today," he said. Placing a folder on the desk, Ashley's expression shifted first, confusion replacing certainty. Daniel straightened slightly, his attention sharpening. Thomas opened the folder and began to explain, not loudly, not dramatically, but with precise clarity, outlining the current legal standing, the ownership, the authority that had never transferred in the way they believed, each sentence removing another layer of assumption. Ashley's posture changed, her confidence giving way to something tighter, less certain. Daniel's eyes moved between Thomas and me, trying to reconcile what he was hearing with what he thought he knew. I remained still, my hands resting lightly on the desk, not interrupting, not adding, simply allowing the truth to take its place. When Thomas finished, the room fell quiet again, but this silence was different, heavier, no longer controlled by them. Ashley opened her mouth slightly, as if to respond, but no words came. Daniel looked at me then, really looked, for the first time in a long while, and I met his gaze with the same calm I had carried from the beginning. "You should both take time to understand what this means," I said softly, my voice steady, not unkind, but final. I stood up then, adjusting my coat, not waiting for permission, not offering further explanation, and as I walked toward the door, I paused just long enough to let one final thought settle in the space behind me. "A burden does not build the foundation you are standing on," I said quietly, and then I left, not in anger, not in triumph, but in something far more complete, the quiet certainty of someone who had finally decided where she stood, and knew she would never be moved from it again.